Hey YouTube. Today we're going to show you how to recone a JBL LE5-2 mid-range. Something about basic, here we go. I want to show you something about basic voice coil setup. This happens to be out of a BMW. The magnet's been knocked off. Used to have a big honking magnet, something like that on there. So the magnet's off, and with the magnet off we can see the top plate. Now the top plate thickness makes the magnetic gap. In this case, look at the winding depth on the voice coil. It's approximately 3 times the thickness of the top plate. So this is what we call an overhung coil. Centered properly, you're going to have as many turns on the top side of the gap as you are on the bottom side of the gap. And as it moves in and out of the gap, you're always going to have the same number of turns in the gap. Now, this is a T-yoke. This goes on the back of the magnet. And this is the pole piece. And the pole piece with the magnet on ends up in here. Right? So, the front side of the magnet is energizing the top plate. The back side of the magnet is energizing the T-yoke and the back plate and the pole piece. So, when you put it all together, then you have the South Pole and the North Pole. And that's how you get your magnetic field. Now, there's 2 other coil configurations you can use besides overhung. You can use an even hung coil, where the winding depth is equal to the thickness of the top plate. Now, when you do that, as you move in and out of the gap, you start ending up with different number of turns in the gap, and therefore a different strength, a BL factor. Now, the other way to do it is called an underhung coil. And with an underhung coil, that would be something that you're not going to get much linear movement here at all with an underhung coil. You're going to get very little movement. So underhung coil is going to be used in a horn-loaded enclosure. Underhung coil would be, the winding depth would be less than the thickness of the top plate. So you always have all the turns in the gap, and you always have the same number of turns in the gap. Alright, that's just a little speaker 101. The reason I bring it up is because the kit for this LE5, JBL has dropped support on this. Now you can still find some JBL kits out there, but you're probably going to have to use an aftermarket kit. And the aftermarket kit comes in pieces. It's not put together already. So with the aftermarket kit, you're going to have to know something about the alignment of the voice coil. And that's why I give you a little taste of the overhung, underhung, and even hung voice coil configurations. Alright, before we get started on this thing, just take a look at it. Look at this expensive finish. The crinkle paint, the really nice looking label. Look how it's dressed out. Look at that workmanship. You know, it costs money to do this. After Harmon bought JBL and installed the corporate mentality, the bean counter said, look, why are you spending all this money on this? When this is in the cabinet, you're only going to see the front. You're wasting a lot of money here, you know, doing this fine work, this dress out, and this paint. So, subsequently, that's what your JBL look like. They went away from the expensive Alnico magnet, and Alnico is aluminum, nickel, and cobalt, and they went to the cheaper ferrite magnets. And as you see, no dressing whatsoever. A stick-on label, and that's it. No dressing, no back can, you know, cheaper connectors even. I mean, you know, corporate mentality for you. Bean counter's in charge. No engineers need apply. Now, normally when we just strip out a basket, we can be pretty brutal about that process. But in this case, I want to get this out in one piece, and I'm going to show you why. Alright, so we're gonna desolder these leads as opposed to just cutting through them, so we can get this kit out of here intact. And one more little detail here about what we're going to do with this one. It's a little different. If you had a JBL kit, you get this dress ring as part of the kit. But even with the JBL kit, when they had them, the dress ring they sent you had a little bit different shape to it. And it's a flat piece, and without a heat gun and a lot of effort, it's kind of hard to get it in there and make it look really pretty. So what we're going to do is reuse this one. And you got to get going around here with your knife till you can get in under it. Get it started peeling away from there. We don't want to scratch it up or tear it up, so we're just going to carefully remove this ring, because we're probably going to reuse this ring. We don't want to pull on it too hard and stretch it all out of shape, because we want it to retain its shape. We'll have to clean that up a little bit. You can see that break in it right there, but we'll scrape all this leftover material off there, clean that up, and we'll reuse it. So we've got pretty much loosened it up all the way around by. Let me get a sharper knife here. I'm just gonna, like I said, normally I'd cut all this away and be quick about it, but what I'm going to do here is just going to get in under here, cut the spider. Okay, now the reason we're doing it like this is because we want to get this out of here intact, so that you can use this to make sure you get your alignments correct. Because even when you know about how to properly align a coil, whether it's overhung, underhung, or even hung, if you have the factory cutout intact, you can use this to make sure that you're going to get your alignments right. Now, it's pretty easy to see the damage here. You see the coil got really hot and separated. And look what happens to the inside of the form of the JBL. See the blistering and the deformation of the voice coil form on the inside? So that's why this has to be rebuilt. Let's take a look at our aftermarket kit. You can find these online. People are always emailing me and asking me, well, where did you get these parts? Where did you find them? Guys, if you're going to do stuff like this, you need to learn how to search. I mean, I can find most of this kind of stuff within a few minutes, and I get people emailing me and saying, I don't know how to find this stuff. Where do I find these kind of things? Well, use a search engine. Alright, so first thing, let's check our winding depth, see how close the aftermarket coil is to the original coil. Get over here where we still got most of the coil intact. Looks pretty close. It's probably 3 millimeters or so. And the other thing we want to look at is the form height, because in an aftermarket kit sometimes they don't get this stuff right. The form height will be too long a lot of times, and if you set the coil too deep in the gap, it's going to bottom out. Now that's not a big problem with a mid-range, but with a woofer, I reconed some AR3As the other day with aftermarket kits, and if I would have dropped them in there the way they had it aligned, I would have bottomed out with about only a 1/4 inch of stroke. So you have to pay attention, and one of the things you want to do is check your form height. So we've got here about 9 millimeters, it looks like. And here, so we've got 11 millimeters. So see, we're a little bit off on the form height. We'll keep that in mind when we put it together. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to put the coil in place with the proper alignment. We're going to shim it internally here up against the pole piece. We're going to use plastic shims. Alright? In the JBL factory kit, you get a cylindrical shim to fit down in there. so, we're going to properly align this and hold it in place with shims. Then we're going to put the spider on, and we're going to glue it around the form, and we're not going to glue it to the spider landing, and we're going to let it dry. That way, when that glue joint here dries, we'll lift the whole thing out, and we'll flip it over, and we'll glue it on the back side too, on the underside. Now, once all that is dried, then we'll drop the spider coil in, and we'll glue the spider down to the spider landing once we have it shimmed in place, and at that point we'll drop in the new cone, and we'll make the final joint with the voice coil form and the cone at this point. Alright, in this case they sent us some shims. You notice here they also sent us lead wire. And that's probably enough lead wire to do 2 of them. But you see the leads attach right here. Okay? So our voice coil wire is going to come up over the top of the cone and come up to about here, and then we're going to punch tiny little holes in the cone, run this wire, lead wire, we're going to run that lead wire up through and twist the coil wire around it. I'm going to show you guys how I do this when we get into it. Okay, we've got our cutout out intact, so notice a couple things here. The spider sits right up against the cone. Alright, there's no gap there. Let me see, I got a cutout over here. Now this is out of a JBL 10-inch woofer, and you see it's quite a bit different. The spider sat right about here, and so there's about a ½ inch between the spider and the cone where you see a good deal of the form exposed. Now that's not going to be the case on this one. You don't see any of the form between the spider and the cone. The cone is in direct contact with the spider. So we can get a sense of how close the winding sets to the spider. But with this coil being burned like it is, we can't get an exact idea where it was. We're pretty good right here. We could go by that. But remember, we've got to have enough of the form stick up above the edge of the cone that we can get a glue bead down in here. Alright, that's a critical glue bead there. There's also going to be glue between the cone and the spider. Alright, when we're handling a delicate little voice coil like this, we want to be careful how often we move these wires, these voice coil wires around right here. If you move them around too much or pull on them too hard, you'll break it right there. And if you break that coil wire right there, you're out of business. So what we've done is it's just held together right now by friction. But I want to show you something here. If, say this was so badly destroyed, or you didn't have it for some reason, somebody brought you one already cut out. Alright, so we're trying to determine the thickness of the top plate. A lot of times you can just turn a speaker on its edge, and you can see how thick the top plate is. But in this case, the JBL frame fits down over the top plate, so you can't see how thick it is from the side. So we're going to have to, the only way we can tell how thick it is from the inside. Now this one, the top plate is thin enough where you can actually see how thick it is if you hold it at an angle and you get light down in there. But if you got a thicker top plate, that might not be the case. Alright, now so here's the way we're going to do it. We're going to take a little piece of metal. In this case I just took a resistor, and I bent the end of it. I made a little L shape on the end of it. Got a Sharpie. Alright, I'm going to take my probe now, and I'm going to stick it down in the gap, and then I'm going to turn it a quarter turn where it's underneath the lip of the top plate, and I'm going to pull up till I'm resting against the top plate. Then I'm going to go right here on the pole piece, and I'm going to make a mark on it. Then I'm going to twist it a quarter turn and bring it back out. Now look at that. You see? Right there is the thickness of my top plate. which happens to be the thickness of the winding depth. Can you see that? Alright, so that makes this an even hung coil. The winding depth is equal to the thickness of the top plate. Therefore, when we shim this coil in here to attach the spider, the top winding is going to set flush with the top of the top plate. Alright, now we've got the alignment done here, and we're glued on the bottom and on the top. Of course, another thing to mention is when you pull the old lead wires and clear this up so you can resolder, take that opportunity before you drop the cone in to tighten those, check the tightness on those two screws. If these grommets look like they're worn out, take your meter on each one and check it against the frame. Make sure you don't have any continuity there. Another thing to make note of is how delicate this coil wire is. We're going to get to the point after we drop this in that we're going to have to attach the lead wires to the voice coil. And when you're doing that, since this wire is so thin and delicate, you've got to make really sure that in the way you handle it, that you don't snap those lead wires off at the top, or those coil wire off at the top of the form. When you make that solder joint to that lead wire, you have to be real careful. We'll show you that later, but let's go to the next step. Alright, this is done, so we're ready to glue this in. But you want to check the gap. Use your magnifier, high intensity light, and look down in that gap and make sure there's no metal shavings in there. And while I was cleaning this frame up, I had that gap taped over with masking tape so nothing would get down in there. Alright, so next step, put a little glue on the spider landing here. Alright, made sure the gap is clean. Got the spider landing glued. So now we're going to drop the assembly in here. Make sure that your wires, your coil wires, line up with the terminals. And we're going to have to use some really thin shims on this. Let's see what they send. Let's see how this fits in here. Yeah, that's good. Alright, so we've got that centered up, and now use any little tool you like, tamp that spider down into that glue. Go all the way around a couple times and make sure that your spider is seated down in that glue bead. Let that glue dry and we'll go on to the next step. Alright, we're ready to put the cone in now. The spider, the voice coil assembly is in place. And if you pay attention, you'll notice I cut the shims down. I didn't want the shims to interfere with the glue bead here on the cone. Before you put your glue on, go ahead and drop your cone in and make sure that it's going to slide down around the former where it needs to be. Set flush. Alright, that all looks good. So we'll go ahead and lift that up and put our glue on. In this case, we don't have a whole lot of room to work here as far as getting the glue where we want it and not where we don't want it. You could sure ruin a recone by getting glue down in that magnetic gap. You glue your voice coil in place, it's not going to make a whole lot of sound. Now in a mid-range or tweeter, it actually will make sound. It won't be like it should be, but if you do that with a woofer, you're going to have some problems. Alright, see, the reason I do it like this is because if I tried to use the nozzle to get it right where I wanted it, I'd be squeezing it, go over the top of the form and make a big mess. So I'm going to put that bead like that. And I'm going to use a bit different kind of glue out here on the edge. It doesn't take a lot, just come around here like this. Remember, we've got this rubber dress ring that goes over the top of this, so we don't want to splash a whole lot of glue up on the side of this cone landing here. Let me get down here and see if I've got it all where I need it. There's some little holidays over here. Alright, so got glue on the cone landing here where we want it. We've got the glue around the voice coil form. There it sits. Now we'll let it tack up a little bit, and then when it starts to tack up, we'll come around here with a tool and we'll make sure that this is all seated where it needs to be. And we let the glue tack a little bit, because if it's open, I got an open tack time here, you can sit here and waste a lot of time pushing on it when the glue's not tacking. So we're going to let that set a few minutes, let the glue get tacky, and then we're going to make sure it's all seated down where it belongs. Alright, I just had a little weight on here to hold the cone down onto the voice coil, so we got a good bond there. Now we get to the tough part of this one. We got to put the lead wires on. And there again, our concern are these little tiny voice coil wires, because if you break that wire off at the top of that form, you're out of luck. Alright, now the dust cap they sent out with this kit is just a little bit different from the original dust cap. So we're going to set this here, and if you remember, the leads are attached right at the outside edge of the original dust cap. So we center this up. Just, you can eyeball it. If you can't eyeball it, well then probably shouldn't be doing this kind of stuff. So I'm going to make a little mark here just so I know where I'm at. Alright, that's the edge of my dust cap. Now the leads are spaced a ½ inch apart, the voice coil wire, and you're got a little bit further spread here on the terminals. So get you an X-Acto knife that has a good sharp point on it. And so this is my center, and this is my mark for the edge of the dust cap. So I want to go up about a couple millimeters, and I want to come over. Now I'm going to make a little hole. Hopefully it's a little hole. I don't want to make a big hole. Alright. And then center up a couple millimeters and over equal distance. Work slowly, don't use a lot of force. You don't want to slice this cone after all the hard work we put into it. Okay, so that's about the right diameter, and then what we're going to do to further this, take something round about the right diameter. I'm going to use a little Phillips screwdriver here, and I'm going to make that hole. I'm going to round it out, you see. Because if I tried to do this with a knife, I might accidentally slice through the cone. That wouldn't be good. So just work that till we get to about the diameter of our lead wire, you see. Okay, now normally when I'm doing this, I'll take the length of this coil wire, I'll bend it around the end, and then I'll spin it around about 6 or 7 times. But when you're doing a woofer recone, you've got a lot thicker wire, and you can do that without a lot of risk. Obviously, this is they've sent us twice as much lead wire as we need. I'm going to take this piece in half. I'm going to put it right through the hole. it's going to hit the spider, so if you can't clear it that way, then come back around here and grab a hold of it and pull it on over here. You can see it's still a lot more than I actually need. So I'm going to pull it right down here close to the cone. And then I'm going to take my coil wire You can see how delicate it is. It's even hard to work with just your bare fingers because it's so small. But you see what I'm doing here? Wrapping that right around there. And 2 or 3 wraps are going to be good. And then, you know, obviously you have to have a fairly small tip on your iron to do this, and a steady hand. I don't know if I have that today. Hold the back of your iron up. Don't let the shoulder of your iron drop down on the edge, because you're going to cause some damage if you do that. Alright, if you're not sure, you might want to use some magnification and some bright light to make sure that you've got that there. And then you put a little bead on it to where it's bigger diameter than that hole we cut, and then push that right down there. You can see, I think you can see if you look carefully, there's your coil wire. Alright, now when the next step here is, I'm just showing you this one, you don't have to show you both of them, but see, I'm going to take some of this light glue here, the water based. And again, we're working with such small areas here that I can't just use the nozzle and just drive it around like I did on like a woofer. But I want to move that glue around to make sure I get good adhesion. Alright, so that looks good. And now a little dab will do you here. Right down to the edge. You want to reinforce that edge. There's going to be a lot of stress on there when it vibrates. You want that. You don't want that wire to have a gap there where it's susceptible to vibration. It's going to eventually break. So you want to go all the way down to right to the edge of the form. And you can use a little tool to... Alright. Okay, as you can see now, we've got our joint made here between our voice coil and our lead wire, and we glued that down and let that glue dry overnight. That needs to be stable so that when you maneuver this lead wire into the terminal, you don't damage that joint. So we let that dry overnight. And now what we've got to do now is put our lead wires into our terminals. And you see they gave us a lot of lead wire here. They gave us a lot more than we need. You don't need a lot of slack here because it's just a mid-range. It's not going to move very far. If you can see that, that's good enough. Now we'll solder that in place. We'll trim the lead wires off. When we get those lead wires soldered in place, we'll show you the final step to complete this thing. Okay, we've got our leads soldered and trimmed now. And one thing I want to say about soldering leads, especially short leads on a mid-range like this, you want to use the least amount of heat and the least amount of solder possible, because if you run solder down that lead wire, that lead wire is going to get stiff, and that lead wire needs to stay flexible. So careful with the heat and the amount of solder on that joint right there. You don't want that solder running down that lead wire and turning it into a stiff piece. Now in like L100s and 4311s and such, this mid-range is running from about 1500 hertz to about 6K. So you could see on my generator, we'll start a little bit below. We'll start a little below 1500. You see how it's pretty much gone at 6K anyway, so we're not right on axis with our mic here in the camera, so you'll get a lot of roll off there, but you see in its operating range we're good. Notice we did that test before we put the dust cap on, because we want to make sure that it's running like it should before we cap it up now. So all we have to do to finish this up now is put on the dust cap. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to grab a little piece of tape here. Because this cap's so small I can't hold on to it. So I'll take a little piece of masking tape and twist that around. And I'll use that to make myself a little handle for the cap. Okay, now this white water-based glue we used here will dry clear, so that'll look good. Now, last thing we're going to do, remember when we took this dress ring off, we retained that ring so we could reuse it. And that's simple enough. All we have to do is run ourselves a little glue bead around here. Put our dress ring back on. It's a little stretched out from where we pulled it off. Make sure it gets seated properly. There again, the white glue with the little overrun we have here and there, it won't matter because it will dry clear. Push it all down and there we go. LE5-2 Recone.